In the middle of the Indian Ocean, roughly 1,000 miles south of India and 1,000 miles east of Africa, there is an American military base. It sits on a British island that belongs, according to the International Court of Justice, to Mauritius. The base has a motto. It calls itself the Footprint of Freedom. The name is not meant to be ironic. It refers to the shape of the atoll, a footprint in the ocean. It refers to American power projection, freedom's reach. It refers to the bombers that flew from this runway to Afghanistan and Iraq, delivering freedom from 30,000 feet. But there is another way to read it. A footprint is what's left when someone has been there and gone. A footprint is an absence in the shape of a presence. A footprint is proof that something stood here once and was removed. Before the base, there were people here, approximately 2,000 of them. They had lived on these islands for nearly 2 centuries. They had a language, a culture, a cemetery full of ancestors. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, every single one of them was removed. Not killed, removed, transported, administratively relocated, wished, hopefully, onto Mauritius. Their footprint was erased so that freedom's footprint could take its place. This is the story of how a population was transformed into an absence, how people became non-people through the drafting of memos, the passing of ordinances, the fiction maintained across decades, how an exception to law became a permanent feature of the world. And it is a story about what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben calls bare life, the condition of human beings who exist outside the protection of any political community. People who can be moved, detained, expelled, or abandoned without any of it registering as a crime. The Chagossians were not murdered. They were something more unsettling. They were subtracted from the category of people who count. The Chagos Archipelago consists of 7 atolls and more than 60 individual islands scattered across the central Indian Ocean. The largest is Diego Garcia, a V-shaped atoll enclosing one of the finest natural harbors in the world. The others have names that sound like poetry: Peros, Banhos, Salomon, Eagle Island, Three Brothers, Great Chagos Bank. For most of human history, these islands were empty, too remote, too small, too lacking in fresh water for permanent settlement. The Maldivians knew of them. Arab traders may have stopped there, but no one stayed. Settlement began in the 1780s when French planters from Mauritius saw an opportunity. The islands could grow coconuts. Coconuts could be processed into copra, dried coconut meat, and copra could be pressed into oil for export. All that was needed was labor. The laborers came from Madagascar, from Mozambique, from the east coast of Africa. They came as slaves. They came on ships that brought them across the ocean to these specks of land, where they would harvest coconuts for masters they had never chosen. When the British took Mauritius from the French in 1810, the Chagos became British too. When slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1835, the slaves became free workers. But they stayed. Where else would they go? This was, by now, the only home they had ever known. Over the generations, something happened that always happens when people live together in isolation. A new people formed. They called themselves the Ilois, the Islanders, in the French Creole that had become their language. They were not French, not African, not Indian, not Malay, though their ancestors had been all of these. They were Chagossian, a people made by the islands themselves. By the mid-20th century, the Chagossian community numbered between 1,500 and 2,000 people. They lived primarily on 3 atolls: Diego Garcia, Peros Banhos, and Salomon. They worked the coconut plantations, but they were not merely workers. They had been there for 5, 6, 7, 8 generations. They had births and deaths, weddings and funerals. They had a church on Diego Garcia where they baptized their children. They had a cemetery where they buried their ancestors. The Greeks had a word for this kind of existence, bios. It means life lived within a political community, life with meaning, with standing, with a past and a future. Bios is not mere survival. It is human life in the full sense, the life of people who belong somewhere. The Chagossians had bios. They were not wealthy. Their economy was simple: copra production, fishing, subsistence. The plantation company provided rations, housing, basic medical care. It was paternalistic, limited, colonial in structure. But it was life, real life, the only life they knew. What was it like, this life before the end? The day began with the sun. Breakfast was often fish, caught that morning or the night before, with rice and coconut. Then work for those on the plantations, the harvesting and processing of coconuts. The men climbed the trees or gathered fallen nuts. The women often worked the drying kilns. Children went to the school on Diego Garcia, where they learned French and basic arithmetic. The pace was slow by metropolitan standards. There was no electricity, no running water, no connection to the outside world except for the ships that came every few months with supplies and news. But there was food, abundant fish in the lagoons, coconut for everything, vegetables from small gardens. There was shelter, there was community. On Sundays, the work stopped. Families gathered, the church filled, the Sega music played, the drum-driven, hip-swaying music that the ancestors had brought from Africa transformed over generations into something distinctly Chagossian. Lisabi Elisei, who was born on Peros Banhos and would later become one of the most powerful witnesses to what happened, described it simply: "We had our houses, we had our animals, we had our church, we had everything we needed, we were happy there." Olivier Bancoul, who would lead the legal fight for decades, was born on Peros Banhos in 1964. He would later say, "My umbilical cord is buried there. That is my home." There is a concept in philosophy. The French thinker Simone Weil called it enracinement, rootedness. She argued that it was a fundamental human need, as essential as food or shelter. To be rooted is to participate really, actively, and naturally in the life of a community which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations of the future. The Chagossians had roots, literal roots, ancestors in the ground, graves to visit, names on headstones, and metaphorical roots, a language that had evolved in isolation, traditions passed from grandparents to grandchildren, knowledge of the reefs and the fish and the seasons that made life possible. They did not own the islands in any legal sense. The land belonged to the plantation companies which leased it from the colonial government. The Chagossians were, in the eyes of British law, employees, residents, a population attached to an economic enterprise. But they belonged to the islands in every sense that mattered. They had nowhere else. They knew nowhere else. The islands were not just where they lived, the islands were who they were. This is what bios means: not property, not legal status, life, human life, rooted in place and time, connected to past and future, embedded in community. And this is what was about to be destroyed. In the early 1960s, planners at the Pentagon were worried. American military bases around the world were becoming politically untenable. In Morocco, in Libya, in the Philippines, local governments were demanding renegotiation, restriction, removal. Decolonization was sweeping the globe, and newly independent nations did not always want American installations on their soil. The solution, developed by naval strategists, including a man named Stuart Barber, was elegant in its cynicism. Find islands so remote, so small, so empty of population that no local government could ever object. Establish bases there permanently. Call it the strategic island concept. The requirements were specific: remote location, natural harbor or space for airfield, no indigenous population or one small enough to be removed, sovereignty held by a reliable ally, meaning Britain. Diego Garcia met every criterion: remote, 1,000 miles from anywhere; harbor, one of the best in the Indian Ocean; population, small, isolated, legally ambiguous; sovereignty, British through the colony of Mauritius. There was just one problem: Mauritius was about to become independent. And when it did, Diego Garcia would belong to the new nation, not to Britain. The Americans would have to negotiate with an African government, exactly the situation they were trying to avoid. The solution required what can only be called legal engineering. In September 1965, representatives of Mauritius were summoned to Lancaster House in London to negotiate the terms of their independence. What they found was not a negotiation but an ultimatum. Britain wanted to detach the Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius before independence. The islands would become a new colony, the British Indian Ocean Territory, directly administered from London. Mauritius would receive £3 million in compensation, and independence could proceed. If Mauritius refused, well, independence might be delayed. The Chagos might be detached anyway, using royal prerogative. It would be unfortunate, regrettable. But the Americans needed their base. The Mauritian Council of Ministers voted to accept. What choice did they have? They were a colony negotiating with their colonizer. They could not speak as a sovereign state because they were not yet a sovereign state. The consent was extracted under duress from a party that had no real power to refuse. On November 8, 1965, the British Indian Ocean Territory was created by order in council, not by act of parliament. That would require debate, scrutiny, democratic accountability. By order in council, using the royal prerogative, the residual power of the crown to act without parliamentary approval, a medieval mechanism deployed for Cold War purposes. The Chagos Archipelago was now British in a new sense, not as part of Mauritius, but as a separate territory, a territory created specifically to be leased to the Americans, a territory that existed from its first moment as an exception. But there was still the problem of the people. The Americans had been clear. The territory must be swept and sanitized. There could be no indigenous population. An indigenous population would have rights, the right to self-determination, the right to object, the right to stay. An indigenous population would create political complications. So the British did something remarkable. They decided that there was no indigenous population. A 1966 Foreign Office memorandum stated the strategy plainly. The purpose of the immigration ordinance is to maintain the fiction that the inhabitants of Chagos are not a permanent or semi-permanent population. The fiction, their word, not mine. They knew it was false. They called it a fiction, and they maintained it anyway. The Chagossians were reclassified. They were not a people. They were contract workers. They were not residents. They were a floating population. They had not lived there for generations. They had origins obscure. They were not Chagossians. They were, in the memorable phrase of Dennis Greenhill of the Foreign Office, some few Tarzans or Man Fridays. The object of the exercise was to get some rocks, which will remain ours. There will be no indigenous population except seagulls who have not yet got a committee. Unfortunately, along with the birds go some few Tarzans or Man Fridays whose origins are obscure and who are being hopefully wished onto Mauritius. Seagulls and Man Fridays, equivalent in legal standing, neither with a committee, neither with rights. This is the moment of transformation, the moment when bios becomes Zoe. Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher whose work has illuminated the dark corners of modern sovereignty, distinguishes between two Greek words for life. Bios is political life, the life of a citizen, a person with standing in a community. Zoe is bare life, mere biological existence, life stripped of political meaning. The Greeks kept these categories separate. Animals have Zoe, only humans have bios. The household was the realm of Zoe, survival, reproduction, necessity. The polis was the realm of bios, speech, action, freedom. Agamben argues that modern sovereignty operates precisely by collapsing this distinction. The sovereign power is the power to decide who has bios and who has only Zoe, who is a citizen and who is merely a body, who counts and who can be disposed of. The British didn't kill the Chagossians. They did something more subtle and, in its way, more complete. They reclassified them through memoranda and ordinances, through legal opinions and diplomatic cables. They transformed a people into a population, citizens into bodies, bios into Zoe, contract workers, floating population, origins obscure, Man Fridays. Each phrase is a subtraction, each category is a diminishment. By the time the process was complete, the Chagossians had been bureaucratically reduced from who they were to what they could be classified as, from people with ancestors and descendants, with language and culture, with roots in the cemetery and the church, to bodies to be relocated, items to be administered, a problem to be solved. The fiction was maintained, and the people became bare life. The deportations happened in stages between 1967 and 1973. The method was not dramatic, it was administrative. First, the supply ships stopped coming as frequently, food became scarce, medical supplies ran low. The message was implicit but clear: life here is no longer sustainable. You should leave. Those who traveled to Mauritius for medical treatment or family visits found they could not return. The ships that had brought them would not take them back. They were stranded, separated from their homes by 1,000 miles of ocean and a wall of bureaucratic refusal. Then came the more direct measures. In 1971, the plantation company on Diego Garcia was closed. The workers were told they had to leave. There was no employment, there were no supplies, there was no future. The final deportations were carried out by ship. The MV Noordvaer, a vessel that normally carried copra and supplies, was repurposed to carry people. The Chagossians were loaded into the hold, the same hold that carried cargo that carried horses. Lizette Talat, who was pregnant during the deportation, described it later. We were like animals and slaves in that ship. People were dying of sadness in that ship. The ship was loaded with horses in the hold, and we were all made to sit on the deck with all our belongings. We were treated like cargo. The journey to Mauritius took days. There was little food, there was little water, there was no dignity. People who had lived their entire lives on those islands, whose ancestors were buried there, whose children had been born there, were transported like freight across an ocean to a country most of them had never seen. There is a detail that appears in testimony after testimony. It has become central to Chagossian memory, a symbol of everything that was done to them. The British killed the dogs, the Chagossians had dogs, pets, companions, part of the community for generations. When the final removals were ordered, someone decided that the dogs could not come. They would not fit on the ships. They might carry disease. They were, in any case, irrelevant to the administrative exercise. So they were rounded up, they were placed in a sealed shed, a hose was connected to a military vehicle's exhaust, the shed was filled with gas. Charlesia Alexis, who was a child at the time, remembered they put the dogs in a building and gassed them. The dogs were barking and crying. We could hear them. We were crying too. Lisby Elise. They killed our dogs in front of us. They put them in a shed and gassed them. They said we would be next if we did not leave. I want to pause on this detail because it illuminates something essential about what was happening. The killing of the dogs was not militarily necessary. It was not economically rational. It was not required by any policy objective. It was gratuitous, a display of power, a message delivered in the language of death. And it was done casually, without legal process, without hesitation, because the dogs, like their owners, had been placed outside the realm of beings whose treatment requires justification. In ancient Roman law, there was a figure called the homo sacer, the sacred man. The name is misleading. The homo sacer was not venerated, he was cursed. The homo sacer was someone who had been expelled from the political community but not into the protection of the gods. He existed in a zone of absolute vulnerability. Anyone could kill him without committing murder, yet he could not be sacrificed. His death had no ritual meaning. He was beneath killing and beyond sacrifice. Pure bare life, exposed to violence but invisible to law. Agamben argues that this figure, far from being an archaic curiosity, reveals the hidden structure of modern sovereignty. The sovereign is the one who decides on the exception, who can suspend the normal legal order, who can place people outside the protection of law while keeping them within the reach of power. The homo sacer is the product of sovereign decision. He is included in the legal order precisely through his exclusion from it. He is abandoned by law, but not released by it. The Chagossians became a kind of homo sacer. They were not killed, but they could be removed without it being recognized as violence. They could be gassed, well, their dogs could be gassed, and threatened with the same, and no one would be prosecuted. They could be transported in cargo holds, stripped of everything, deposited in slums, and none of this would appear in the legal record as a crime, because they had been placed outside the realm of beings whose suffering registers as suffering. Contract workers, floating population, man Fridays with origins obscure, not a people, just bodies, bare life. The memos that authorized their removal do not read like orders for ethnic cleansing. They read like administrative correspondence. The object of the exercise. Hopefully wished on to Mauritius. Maintain the fiction. The language is bureaucratic, almost bored, because violence against bare life does not require justification. It barely requires notation. What happened to the people after they arrived? They were deposited in Mauritius and the Seychelles. Some received small amounts of money, most received nothing. They had no housing, no employment, no social connections in a society that viewed them as outsiders. Many ended up in the slums near the docks of Port Louis. Families that had been self-sufficient on the islands, growing vegetables, fishing, harvesting coconuts, found themselves in urban poverty without skills that translated to this new environment, without resources, without hope. And then they began to die, not from violence, not from disease, from something else. The Chagossians have a word for it, sagren. It means profound sadness, soul-deep grief, a broken heart. Lisa B. Elise. Some people did die. They died of sagren, sadness. The elders, especially, could not survive the transplantation. They had been rooted in those islands for their entire lives. Their parents and grandparents were buried there. The rhythms of their days, the meanings of their lives were inseparable from that place. Removed from it, they withered. There is no medical diagnosis for sagren. It does not appear in official records. The death certificates would have listed other causes, heart failure perhaps, or general decline. But the community knows, the community remembers, the people died of sadness. This is what it means to be reduced from bios to zoe. Political life sustains people, community sustains people, roots sustain people. When you are treated as nothing more than bare life, a body to be moved, a problem to be solved, the soul begins to die before the body does. While the Chagossians died of sadness in the slums of Port Louis, construction proceeded on Diego Garcia. The U.S. Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia became operational in 1973. The same year, the last Chagossians were removed from Peros Banhos and Salomon. A runway was built, eventually extended to 12,000 feet, long enough for any aircraft in the American arsenal. A harbor was dredged and expanded. Barracks, communications facilities, fuel storage, munitions depots, all the infrastructure of modern military power. Today, Diego Garcia hosts between 3,000 and 5,000 personnel, military and contractor, American and British. It is a key node in the global network of American power projection. B-52 bombers, B-1 bombers, B-2 stealth bombers have all flown missions from its runway. Aircraft carriers dock in its harbor, submarines surface in its waters, satellites are tracked, communications are intercepted. The business of empire proceeds around the clock. The base has a name that appears on patches and signs, Camp Justice, and a motto, the footprint of freedom. Giorgio Agamben argues that the camp, not the prison, not the asylum, but the camp, is the paradigm of modern political space. He does not mean only concentration camps, though those are the most extreme examples. He means any space where the state of exception becomes the rule, any space where normal law is suspended, any space where human beings are reduced to bare life and held at the mercy of sovereign power. The camp is what opens up when the exception becomes permanent, when a space is created where the normal legal order does not apply, where people can be held, interrogated, detained without the protections that would obtain elsewhere. Guantanamo Bay is a camp in this sense. So are the offshore processing centers where asylum seekers are detained. So are the black sites where the CIA held prisoners during the War on Terror, and so is Diego Garcia. Consider what Diego Garcia is. It is British sovereign territory, but administered for American military purposes. It is subject to British law, but British courts have been told repeatedly that matters of security prevent judicial review. It is part of the international order, but the International Court of Justice has ruled that Britain's presence there is unlawful, and Britain has not left. It is a space where American law does not fully apply because it is British territory, and where British law does not fully apply because American military necessity overrides it. a zone of indistinction, a legal black hole. When allegations emerged that Diego Garcia had been used for CIA extraordinary rendition, the extrajudicial transfer of prisoners to countries where they could be tortured, the British government initially denied it. Then, in 2008, Foreign Secretary David Miliband admitted that 2 rendition flights had in fact landed at Diego Garcia, refueled, and continued. The previous denials had been based on incorrect information from the United States. Only 2 flights, the government insisted. The prisoners remained on the aircraft. No interrogation occurred on the island itself. Human rights organizations do not believe this. They have documented numerous flights by CIA-linked aircraft to Diego Garcia. They suspect the island was used not just as a transit point, but as a holding facility, a black site in the Indian Ocean, conveniently located beyond the reach of any legal system. We may never know the full truth. Diego Garcia is one of the most restricted spaces on Earth. Journalists are not permitted. Human rights investigators are not permitted. The people who once lived there are not permitted. The only observers are those who serve the apparatus of security. But this much is clear. Diego Garcia functions as a camp in Agamben's sense, a space of exception, a zone where normal rules do not apply, where bare life, whether Chagossian deportees in the 1970s or rendered prisoners in the 2000s, confront sovereign power without the mediation of law. The cemetery is still there. When the Chagossians were removed, their ancestors stayed behind. The graves remain on Diego Garcia within the perimeter of the military base. American service members sometimes visit them, a tourist curiosity, a trace of the people who used to live here. The Chagossians cannot visit. They are not permitted on the island. Their ancestors' graves are maintained or not maintained by foreigners. The roots that Simone Weil called essential to human existence have been severed and paved over. The footprint of freedom stands where the footprint of the Iloa once stood. This is what the camp does. It does not merely exclude, it occupies. It takes the space where life once flourished and repurposes it for the exception. The removal of the Chagossians was not incidental to Diego Garcia. It was foundational. The base exists because they were removed. The exception was their expulsion, and the exception has become permanent. The Chagossians did not disappear quietly. They organized, they protested, they sued. In 1975, a group of Chagossians in Mauritius formed what would become the Chagos Refugees Group. Their leader eventually was Olivier Bancu, the boy who had been taken to Mauritius for medical treatment and never allowed to return. Now a man, now a symbol, now the face of a people's demand for justice. The legal arguments were complex, but the moral core was simple. We are a people. We had a home. We were taken from that home illegally. We want to go back. In 2000, the case of Regina versus Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, ex parte Bancu, reached the High Court of England and Wales. The judge was Lord Justice Laws. The question before the court was the 1971 immigration ordinance, the law that made it illegal for Chagossians to enter their own homeland, valid. Lord Justice Laws ruled that it was not. The removal of the Chagossians from the British Indian Ocean Territory was an outrageous abuse of power. An outrageous abuse of power. The words rang through the legal community. For the first time, a court had acknowledged what had been done. The government accepted the ruling. Foreign Secretary Robin Cook issued a statement. The removal of the Chagossians from the British Indian Ocean Territory is an episode in our history which we should not forget and which we should reflect upon with regret. It seemed for a moment that justice might be done. The Chagossians would be allowed to return, at least to the outer islands, if not to Diego Garcia itself. A feasibility study was commissioned. Plans were discussed. Hope flickered. Then, in 2004, the government changed its mind. Without warning, without parliamentary debate, using the royal prerogative, the same medieval power that had created BOT in the first place, the Blair government issued 2 orders in council, the BOT Constitution Order 2004 and the BOT Immigration Order 2004. The effect was simple and devastating. The Chagossians were once again banned from their homeland. The 2000 victory was erased, the right of return was extinguished. Section 9 of the BIOT Constitution Order stated plainly, no person has the right of abode in the territory. No person, not some persons, no person. The Chagossians were not merely excluded, they were defined out of existence. The ban was absolute. Agamben writes that the ban is the fundamental structure of sovereignty. The sovereign is not simply the one who rules. The sovereign is the one who can place people outside the law while keeping them within its power. The ban does not merely expel, it creates a relation of abandonment. The banned person remains connected to the law precisely through their exclusion from it. They are not free of sovereign power. They are held by it in a state of exception. The Chagossians after 2004 were banned in exactly this sense. They were British. BIOT was British sovereign territory, and they had been born there under British authority. But they had no right of abode. They were included in British sovereignty precisely as those who were excluded from it. The orders in council created a perfect circle of exclusion. You are ours, therefore you cannot enter. You belong to us, therefore you are banned. This is the structure of sovereign abandonment. This is what it means to be held in the exception. Banku challenged the 2004 orders in council. He won in the High Court. He won in the Court of Appeal. The judges again found the government's actions unlawful. But in 2008, the case reached the House of Lords, then the highest court in the United Kingdom. And there, by a vote of 3-2, the Chagossians lost. The majority held that the royal prerogative was essentially unlimited. If the Crown chose to ban people from British territory, the courts had no power to override that choice. Foreign policy, security, matters of state, these were beyond judicial review. Lord Bingham dissented. The suggestion that a minister can, through the means of an pointedly short act and without the authority of Parliament, exile a whole population from its homeland and claim it is acting for the benefit of the territory is repugnant to fundamental principles of our law. Lord Mance also dissented, but the majority held, the exception remained. The Chagossians had lost in British courts, but there was another forum, international law. In 2017, the United Nations General Assembly voted to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Was Britain's detachment of the Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius in 1965 lawful? And what were the legal consequences of Britain's continued administration of the territory? On February 25, 2019, the International Court of Justice delivered its opinion. The vote was 13-1. The court found that the detachment of Chagos from Mauritius was not based on the free and genuine expression of the will of the people concerned. The consent at Lancaster House was extracted under duress from a colony that could not speak as a sovereign state. It was invalid. The court found that the right to self-determination had crystallized into binding international law by 1965. Britain had violated that right by detaching Chagos before Mauritian independence. And the court found that Britain's continued administration of the Chagos Archipelago was an unlawful act of a continuing character. Britain should end its administration as rapidly as possible. In May 2019, the UN General Assembly voted to demand British withdrawal. 116 in favour, 6 against. Britain was given 6 months. Britain did not leave. The 6 months passed, then a year, then 2 years, then 5 years. The legal situation was clear. The highest international court had ruled. The overwhelming majority of nations had voted. But the base remained. The exception continued. This is the nature of the exception. It does not submit to law because it is, by definition, outside law. The exception is the sovereign space, the space where normal rules do not apply. International opinion can be ignored. Court rulings can be dismissed. The exception persists because power wills it to persist. Then, in October 2024, something shifted. The British government, now under Labour, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, announced an agreement. Sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago would be transferred to Mauritius. Britain's administration would end. But the exception did not close. It transformed. Diego Garcia would continue to operate. A 99-year lease would secure the base for the United States and United Kingdom. The military installation would remain. The strategic footprint would endure, and the Chagossians, they might be permitted to return to the outer islands, not Diego Garcia, but Peros Banhos, Salomon, the places their ancestors had lived, maybe, eventually, under terms to be determined by Mauritius, not by them. Many Chagossians reacted not with celebration, but with fury. They had not been consulted. They had not been present at the negotiations. Their fate had been decided once again by others, by London and Port Louis, not by the Chagos refugees group. Nothing about us without us, they had demanded, but the deal was made without them. Consider what the 2024 agreement actually does. It transfers sovereignty. Mauritius will formally own the Chagos Archipelago. The British Indian Ocean Territory, as a colonial entity, will cease to exist, but the camp remains. Diego Garcia will operate for another 99 years under American and British control. The runway will still launch bombers. The harbor will still receive warships. The communications facilities will still intercept signals. The zone of exception will still function. The Chagossians who were born on Diego Garcia can still not return to their birthplace. Their ancestors' graves are still inaccessible. The footprint of freedom still stands where their footprint was erased. Agamben wrote that the state of exception tends to become the rule. Temporary measures become permanent. Emergency powers become normal powers. The space where law is suspended expands until it covers more and more of political life. Diego Garcia is the proof. 60 years after the first Chagossians were removed, 50 years after the last ones were deported, the exception continues. Sovereignty changes hands, but the camp persists. The ban is modified, but the exclusion endures. This is not resolution. This is transformation. The exception finding a new legal form. Let me return to where we began. There are graves on Diego Garcia, Chagossian graves, the resting places of generations, the roots that Simone Weil said were essential to human existence. Those graves are now within the perimeter of a military base. They are maintained or not maintained by people who did not know the dead. They are visited or not visited by no one who mourned them. The Chagossians who survive in Mauritius, in Seychelles, in Crawley, in scattered communities across the world cannot visit their ancestors. They cannot stand where their umbilical cords were buried. They cannot touch the ground that made them who they are. The ICJ ruled that Britain's actions were unlawful. The UN demanded withdrawal. A deal has been struck. Sovereignty will transfer. But some things cannot be restored by law. The people who died of sagren cannot be brought back. The generations born in exile who never knew the islands cannot be given the childhood they would have had. The language that is fading, the traditions that are fragmenting, the community that was shattered, these cannot be reassembled by court order. Law can recognize injustice, law can demand remedy, but law cannot undo what bare life experiences. The reduction from bios to zoe leaves scars that no legal formula can heal. And here is the final unsettling point. The Chagos story is not unique, it is exemplary. All over the world, zones of exception are multiplying. Refugee camps where people wait for years, for decades, in legal limbo. Border zones where rights do not apply. Offshore detention centers, rendition networks, black sites, permanent emergencies that suspend normal law indefinitely. Agamben saw this coming. He wrote that the exception would expand, that it would become the dominant paradigm of modern governance. He was called alarmist. He was called extreme. But look at the world. Diego Garcia is not an aberration. It is a model, a proof of concept, demonstration that a population can be removed, a zone can be created, an exception can be maintained for decades, and the world will keep turning. The bombers will keep flying. The footprint of freedom will keep expanding. What would it mean to actually close the exception? Not to transfer sovereignty from one power to another, not to negotiate leases and resettlement schemes, but to restore bios, to treat the Chagossians not as a problem to be administered, but as a people to be recognized, to give them what they have always demanded, not charity, not compensation, but return, not permission, but right. The 2024 deal does not do this. It transfers the exception It modifies the ban. It creates new legal forms for the same fundamental exclusion. Perhaps that is all that can be expected. Perhaps the exception, once established, cannot truly be closed. Perhaps bare life, once produced, cannot be restored to full political existence. Perhaps some injuries are beyond remedy, or perhaps not. Perhaps the Chagossians will return to the outer islands. Perhaps a new generation will be born there. Perhaps the language will revive. Perhaps the sega will play again on the beaches of Perros Banjos. But Diego Garcia will remain a camp for 99 years. And then, who knows, the exception has a way of renewing itself, the footprint of freedom. It is what remains when someone has been there and gone, an absence in the shape of a presence, proof that something stood here once and was removed. The Chagossians had a footprint too, 5 to 8 generations of footprints crossing and recrossing the same ground, wearing paths from home to church, from village to shore, from the living to the graves of the dead. That footprint was erased, paved over, built upon. The islands that formed a people were transformed into a platform for power. The home became a base. The cemetery became a curiosity. The Iloa became Man Fridays and then became nothing at all. But footprints have a way of persisting in memory, in testimony, in the stubborn insistence of the survivors that they were there, that they existed, that they mattered. The Chagossians are still here in Mauritius and Crawley, in courtrooms and UN chambers, in the archives of injustice and the records of resistance. They are still saying what they have always said: we are a people, we had a home, we want to go back. The exception continues, but so does the claim, so does the memory, so does the refusal to be reduced to bare life. The footprint of freedom is everywhere, but so is the footprint of the Iloa, and the question of which will prevail is not yet answered.